We're finally looking at a non-XT version of the RX 5700, and the first one we received is the PowerColor RX 5700 Red Dragon, which comes with dual V BIOS to match its dual axial cooler. The card is a proper 2-slot design with a more muted, less gamery aesthetic, but more importantly, it should serve as a competitive alternative to the reference model and its cursed blower fan. The RX 5700 Red Dragon is priced at $360, about $10 over MSRP for the 5700 reference card, and comes in about $50 to $60 under the 5700 XT partner models that we've recommended so far. Today, we're looking at thermals, acoustics, and some gaming performance with overclocking numbers for the Red Dragon variant. Before that, this video is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace is what we've been using for years to manage our own Gamers Nexus store, and we've been incredibly happy with the choice. Squarespace makes e-commerce easy for those interested in starting stores, but it also has powerful tools to build all types of websites. Photo galleries for photographers, resume and portfolio sites, and small business sites are all easily done through Squarespace. Having built a lot of client websites the old way before running GN full-time, we can easily recommend Squarespace as a powerful, fast solution. Go to squarespace.com/gamersnexus to get 10% off your first purchase with Squarespace. I'd actually forgotten what a proper 2-slot card looks like. You start to question whether a 2 is a 2.3 because RTX has trained us otherwise. But this is a true 2-slot card. It's an RX 5700. It's a lower power consuming device, so they can get away with a smaller cooler. There are 2 VBIOS options on it, which is always great to see. That gives you a backup in case you screw something up, or if you'd like, and if the 2 options are meaningfully different, you could use one switch set a lower fan curve if you wanted to do that instead of through software, because AMD's fan software is garbage. So the 5700 Red Dragon card, it's the 2 VBIOSes. The default one is the OC mode. That's got 170 watt power target as read by GPU-Z. It's different from the power consumption measured externally, but by GPU-Z numbers, that puts you at 170 watts. And then the 150 watt, or 155 watt rather, number is from the silent VBIOS. That'd be the front-facing position if you want to use that. It lowers the power consumption, the power allowance, power budget, and therefore the temperatures will come down a bit, so the fans can come down a bit, stuff like that. Anyway, this card is supposed to be $360 or thereabouts. Puts it a little over the reference card, and if it does well in our testing, as you'll see today, it's worth the $10 to get something that has significant quality of life improvements. That brings me to the next point, which is that these cards, once you get past the GPU itself, which is what we look at in, say, the 5700 benchmarks that we most recently published in our Sapphire Pulse 5700 XT review, these numbers should be in there, and if not, they're in some of the other ones like the Evoke. But once you get past the GPU itself, which is made by AMD and sold to the board partners, the main difference you're looking at is quality of life. And that's going to be things like how loud is it? How well does it fit in the cases? And what are the thermals like? Things like that. Overclocking, for the most part, is dictated by silicon quality more than anything else. Now, at some level, you will run into thermal limitations with overclocking, but that requires to actually have good silicon to get there. So we're focusing on, once again, the thermals, the acoustics. We have frequency numbers for this because they're relevant, and because this is the first 5700 non-XT that we're looking at, all the others were XTs, we'll go ahead and go through some of the gaming numbers again and show if it differs from that one, from the one AMD made and the one that has the deafening blower fan when allowed to run at higher RPMs. So that's what we're looking at today. We do have other 5700s that just got in at day of filming, and so we'll look at those next to see if this card does well versus some of the others. But so far we can start with the 5700 non-XT Red Dragon versus the non-XT reference card and show you, in the very least, whether it passes the good enough test. So let's get into some of the numbers, and then we'll talk about conclusions, see if you should wait or if it's actually worth buying. Before we get into the numbers here, quick reminder on AMD. AMD's drivers and API are extremely flawed with fan reporting. So in some of the fan testing, the RPMs, you'll see occasional spikes that will read as a point to 4,000 or 5,000 RPM. It's one point in time, it looks like a 1-second spike. That's not happening in reality. We validated that with external RPM measurement tools, and it seems to be just erroneous software, or API rather, reporting by AMD's API and drivers. So those numbers, when you see the spikes, they're not real. It's actually the same as the 2 digits around it. As far as modifying the fan RPMs, that's still really bugged. That's an AMD driver bug. And AMD's drivers will report the last known reading when the fans are at 0. So when this goes down to 0 RPM mode, it'll actually report something like, let's say, 1200 RPM if you're in silent. But then you can physically look at the card, like with your eyes, and see that the fans aren't moving. So that's an AMD issue as well, but wanted to point those out because you'll see that reflected in some of the charts. We're starting with a frequency plot to help us see how the RX 5700 non-XT model compares to the XT model, but also how the reference non-XT compares to the PowerColor Red Dragon variant. Plotting the reference line first, we can see that the RX 5700 non-XT reference model caps out at about 1720 MHz in 3D Mark Firestrike Extreme. The spikes toward the end are reporting errors that occur in AMD's API and can be ignored. The average frequency is about 1720 MHz, but as we plot the PowerColor 5700 Red Dragon line, we can see that the number improve toward 1740 to 1750 MHz, offering a slight pre-overclock. The line is less consistent and fluctuates more, which is associated with bouncing off some of the limiters. This is typically thermal, but in the case of the Red Dragon, it's more likely power or voltage. Just for point of reference, we'll also plot our most recently reviewed RX 5700 XT model, the Gigabyte Gaming OC. This card had roughly the same frequency as the Sapphire Pulse, which itself isn't much different from the reference XT. The XT model plots at around 1880 to 1920 MHz, a significant uplift that'll show more performance than the CU Delta in many games. There's a reason AMD artificially locked the frequency, and that reason is product segmentation, something that AMD told us directly in a room full of their experts in a meeting in California. The silent BIOS fluctuates a lot more heavily and also has more erroneous spikes, but overall ranges from 1689 MHz to 1800 MHz, with average frequency closer to about 1720 to 1730. It's not that much worse on average than the default OC BIOS, but does fluctuate more heavily and have a lot lower frequency floor. Our noise normalized testing is next. For the 5700 XT charts, this is starting to grow to a longer list of cards, but we've only recently gotten our first 5700 non-XT partner model in, so for now it's just reference and the Red Dragon. Here's the full chart, normalized to 40 dBA to control for fan speed and test coolers for efficiency versus noise. The PowerColor Red Dragon edge temperature ends up at 62.6 degrees Celsius average for the run, with the junction temperature stretching to 75 degrees. As a reminder, junction temperature is the maximum temperature on any single sensor across the thermal sensor network on the die, and so helps to illustrate potential mounting issues or weaknesses in the cooler. This 15-degree delta isn't that bad when compared to some other cards we've tested in the XT line, and overall the Red Dragon is looking reasonable when tested in a vacuum. The world isn't a vacuum though, and until we get other partner models in, we can at least add reference to the chart. The AMD RX 5700 reference card runs a GPU edge temperature of about 87.2 degrees Celsius average, where its junction temperature hits 99 degrees Celsius average. The reference design is struggling to keep up when forced to lower noise levels than it would typically run under this load, and so where the PowerColor card is completely fine and well below spec, the reference card would be throttling in a case with a warm ambient. Remember that our ambient temperature is just 21 degrees Celsius, while a modern case would easily be in the 30s in our ambient room temperature. If you're in an area of the world where ambient is higher, or where you don't have AC, that also needs to be factored in. The Red Dragon is superior here. Looking next at GDDR6 and VRM Mosfet temperatures under the same 40 dBA noise normalized configuration, the PowerColor Red Dragon GDDR6 measurement reads an average of 68 degrees Celsius, with the VRM Mosfet temperature at 57 degrees. This is way below spec and is well cooled for both. The MOSFET can handle well over 100 degrees, and the GDDR6 module can take a bit over 100, so we're not even close to danger in a worst case chassis. The reference card reported a G6 temperature of 88 degrees with the MOSFET at 71. The GDDR6 modules are getting heated here, and transplanting into an actual case would start to push the capabilities of the design if trying to retain a lower fan noise with the original cooler. Of course, you could also just run it auto, at which point the 5700 blower cooler could handle it, but you'd also be looking at 50 plus dBA of noise at a 20-inch distance by our measurements. In the end, it's all about comparatives. The Red Dragon card, comparatively, is doing much better here. It's just a question of if other partner models beat the Red Dragon when we test them later. Finally, with regard to auto settings, this quick steady state chart shows thermals when the cards are allowed to operate automatically unless otherwise noted. If you want XT thermals of the same variety, check out recent Gigabyte Gaming OC review for all of those. For this one, the Silent V BIOS seems to stick the fan speeds to around 1200 RPM average while at 155 watt GPU power. The OC BIOS sticks closer to 1300 RPM, but it also has a power target of 170 watts. That extra 15 watts generates heat, naturally, and so we see the OC BIOS running warmer while retaining a similar fan speed to the original results. For comparison, 40 dBA is about 1800 RPM, so we're increasing the noise level baseline on this card, but decreasing it on the reference model. The self-regulated fan speeds have the OC BIOS GPU edge temperature at 72 degrees and junction at 85, while the Silent BIOS runs 68 degrees and 79 degrees. For GDDR6 and Vrm Mosfet temperatures, the Silent model runs at around 76 degrees for GDDR6, thanks to the reduced heat load spreading from the GPU, while Vrm Mos temperatures are at around 64. The OC BIOS sits closer to 80 degrees and 68 degrees, but doesn't aggressively ramp fan speed either. The reference card under auto settings averages about 80 degrees for GDDR6 for reference, but is significantly louder. Fan behavior was a bit odd for this one. We retested the OC BIOS a few times because we had some issues where it sometimes wouldn't apply or recognize properly, ultimately a fault of AMD's drivers, we think, because clearing them and going through registry entries seemed to resolve the issue. Eventually, when it did apply properly, we noticed that the fan curve doesn't dictate ramping hard until about 90 degrees GPU temperature, which we didn't reach during the Vrm workload. With temperature closer to 74, the fan only ever ramps to about 1300 RPM. We also noticed that the fan pushed harder at the outset, but did eventually come back down as the fan curve settled versus the GPU temperature. When we talked with PowerColor about the anomalous fan speed ramping at the beginning of the curve, something that shouldn't be happening, the company noted that it has recently become aware of this issue, and it's likely going to reissue a new OC BIOS version to conform the fan curve to a more normal behavior, like ramping from down to up rather than up to down to up, which is a bit inefficient. As we've said before, overclocking is more dictated by the GPU and memory silicon than it is by the cards themselves until you get into LN2 or something. This gets a bit different for the RX 5700 series, where AMD has also artificially locked down the memory and GPU overclocking alike. Further, frustratingly for us, we found that our RX 5700 series cards overclock the memory slightly better to significantly better than our 5700 XT cards, which is more likely a luck of the draw difference than anything else. Too bad it's not easily swappable. Also, as a final note, these limitations can be bypassed with the more power tool, and we've done it in streams, but we're not going to do that here. We don't see that as part of a core review process, and if we do any unlocking of these cards, we'll save it for a separate content piece. This chart shows 3D Mark time SPI results for GT1 and GT2. We're only going to show RX 5700 series scaling so that it's cleaner and easier to see how the changes impact performance. For comparisons versus the RTX series, you can check some of our other recent reviews like the MSI Evoke for the most recent, or you can just look at the gaming results coming up. We're sorting by total score here, not shown. That's a combination of the two GT scores. The RX 5700 Red Dragon ended up at 52.1 FPS average for GT1, the GPU core workload, when fully stock, with a 42.2 GT2 score stock. Adding plus 20% power allowance brings the score up significantly, moving to 53.3 GT1 and 43.5 GT2. If 1 FPS doesn't sound like a lot, keep in mind that this is a synthetic test and that every 1 FPS becomes a big deal given its consistency in testing. The change in score, not listed here, is 7648 points to 7850 points averaged. That's a 2.6% gain just from increasing the power target and nothing else. We were also able to bump memory all the way up to its maximum 930 MHz and still see gains, at which point we'll need the more power tool to unlock further overclocking headroom. With this configuration, we hit 53.9 FPS average for GT1, 44 on the more memory-bound GT2 test, and the end result is a gain of about 4.3% performance just in the GT2 memory test. Again, that's a pretty large gain for only memory overclocking and extra power. Versus the plus 20% power number of 43.5, we gained 1.2%. Versus the baseline number, again, is about 4.3%. Overclocking the core and memory to final values got performance up to 55 FPS GT1 and 44.7 GT2, posting a top-to-bottom change of 5.7% by the total scores. That's a jump from 7647.5 points average with the stock setup to 8081 points with the 1850 MHz and 950 MHz setup. And a reminder, typing in 1850 MHz, which is the max permissible with 5700 non-XT cards, doesn't mean you get actually 1850. That's set, whereas the get frequency will be a bit lower than that. This is also why, looking at these scores, AMD locked down these cards, because the gap between the stock XT and non-XT with an overclock is about 9%, not that much between two SKUs. We should be able to overcome this with modding, but that starts to exit how most people use the cards. Of course, you can also always overclock the XT past that, so that CU advantage will benefit it eventually, although not every game cares. We're only going to show a few game results here. Again, for the full suite of gaming benchmarks, we'd encourage checking out our RX 5700 XT Pulse review, as that has the most updated information with all of the charts, or at least almost all of them. For this one, since we've already established baseline 5700 non-XT performance, we just need to show the average delta from the partner model PowerColor card. We're also sticking to the higher performing OC BIOS for these. The silent BIOS drops 15 watts, and so we'll have reduced performance closer to the 5700 non-XT reference card. The RX 5700 reference card ran at 110 FPS average with lows at 91 and 79 FPS for 0.1%. The RX 5700 Red Dragon card with the stock BIOS position, that'd be the OC BIOS, but it's not overclocked by us, operated at a 113 FPS average with picked up lows accordingly. The gap is about a 2.4% improvement, which is similar to what we saw with the MSI Evoke 5700 XT card when tested against the 5700 XT from Sapphire and AMD. Overclocking the 5700 stock model to its limits did improve our averages to 114 FPS, but we started dropping frames in the low department and experienced instability that caused more frame time deviation from the mean, thus creating a worse experience in spite of technically higher averages. This is why we measure more than just average and look at frame times, and also why we're going to remove the OC results from the rest of the games. At 1440p in the same game, the Red Dragon card managed 77 FPS average versus the reference 76, which isn't quite within our run-to-run variance in this game of about 0.2 FPS average, but it's close enough. Even if it's not error, it's still imperceptible and irrelevant. You're not buying these cards for the extra frames out of the box. You're buying them for quality of life improvements to thermals and especially noise. We won't bother going into the 4K results here. It's the same type of scaling, just a lot harder on this particular card. Strange Brigade is next, although we do testing with both Vulkan and DirectX 12 for this one. We've shown that AMD sometimes has a slight advantage in DX12 versus Vulkan for this game's implementation. Advantage versus itself, that is. Either way, it's never more than a couple percent swing and typically favoring DX12 for AMD. The RX 5700 non-XT reference model performed at 112.5 FPS average with lows reasonably close behind and within the pacing we'd expect for frame times. The RX 5700 Red Dragon placed at 114.4 FPS average, a gain of about 1.7% over the reference model. Overclocking will vary chip to chip, but obviously these could begin encroaching on RX 5700 XT levels with some overclocks, assuming you don't also overclock the 5700 XT. We'll throw Hitman 2 with DirectX 11 in here as well. Hitman 2 runs like garbage on DX12, something we've shown before, as its frame time consistency is all over the place. The 5700 ran at 75.6 FPS average, with the Red Dragon at 79.3 FPS average. The delta is about 4.8%, one of the bigger gaps that we've seen. Finally, with GTA 5 at 1080p, the RX 5700 ran at 172 FPS average, while the Red Dragon hit 131, with the improved lows as well. The overall gain is about 3.1%, which isn't bad for just a card purchase, but this is all out of box for both. So we should note that it's possible to get the reference card up to this level without much work, but the reference cooler isn't good anyway, so there's no point in us defending the card at all. So that's the 5700 non-XT Red Dragon. The price we think is good. The cooling performance is definitely better than reference in a significant way. The question remains, is it better comparatively versus the other board partner cards? And we don't have that data today, but of course you can subscribe to catch it as soon as it goes up. Versus reference though, it's better, and the biggest thing is there anything massively flawed in the design? Like the Evoke had some pretty big flaws or oversights, and the answer is, in terms of cooling, no, not really. There's an OCV BIOS revision that needs to be made on this card to fix that fan curve, but PowerColor is aware of it. We've been talking to them about the issue, and they are working on a fix. So, and that's just BIOS. We're pretty confident they'll get that resolved because it's trivial overall, and also something users could update if they needed to. The cooler physically is what we need to look at next. So thermals are fine. Everything's good there. Comparatively, we don't know how it does versus, say, Sapphire MSI, but we can look at that next. And they are all well within spec, though, well below reference. And we just need to take this card apart. So that'll be a separate video. We'll have a teardown of the 5700 Red Dragon. If you want to see that, make sure you subscribe to check back. And big reminder here that when it comes to things like overclocking, once again, that is going to come down to silicon level differences more than anything else on the table. So one card to the next, you're just as likely to get a really high-end, good overclocking GPU or memory on this one as on this one. Whether the cooling solution will enable it is maybe a different story depending on the use, but for the most part, you're looking at differences in noise levels and thermals and things like that under really any condition stock for the most part. That's it for this one. Thank you for watching. You can subscribe for more or go to store.gamersnexus.net if you'd like to support us directly, like by buying one of our mod mats on the table here or one of our toolkits. You can also go to patreon.com/gamersnexus. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.